I'm very interested in answering questions, but just kind of a little bit about who I am and what I make and why I make it. We were driving here and we were listening to Madonna's Immaculate Collection, which is the best of Madonna album. And it always pops into my head the movie Desperately Seeking Susan that was made in like 1985. Y'all remember this? Okay. The premise doesn't matter. But Madonna is not playing Madonna. She's playing some street urchin girl who just has a joie de vivre and lives for the nightlife. And she goes to a nightclub. It's a basement nightclub. And they're pumping Get Into the Groove by Madonna. And she walks down into the stairs and she hears the music and she walks in this way where she's like feeling her own music, except she's not Madonna. She's a person who's not Madonna grooving to her own music that's made by Madonna. And that etched into my mind for a variety of reasons. And I always talk about it in my talks because I love Madonna. It etched into my mind because it was completely ridiculous. It's laughable. It's the campiest thing it's one of the campiest movies in the 80s, and the 80s are well known for that, right? And I cull a lot of my images from the 80s for that very reason, that sort of nostalgia, for this really unself-conscious absurdity. She's really cool in it though. She's beautiful, she's young, like she is at the prime of her life. She's just been discovered, right, in her actual life, in her career. And she is just a buffoon dancing to her own music, pretending it's somebody else's. So there's a sort of meta thing that's happening in it that in a weird way kind of predicted the absurdity of the internet and how mediation would be curated in ways that don't make sense. Like she could have been dancing to some other song. And she's so cool in that scene, even though the premise is just simply absurd. And in a weird way, film was a way for me to have like a queer awakening. I saw her and I was like, oh my God, I want to be her. And then I thought, well, I kind of want to be with her, but I also want to be her. And that's like, women get that all the time. My wife and I, when we would be in the South, we would get asked all the time if we were sisters. She's like 125 pounds, 6 foot tall, and I'm like me. And we don't look alike. We're just white women, pointy white women. And so there's this ersatz like sibling thing to gay culture. Do I want to be her or do I want to be with her? So I think of that scene a lot. And in a weird way, I think it speaks to the work that is most recent, which is the colored work. On the side, you've got some black and white images. Those are a little bit older. A little bit about how I work. Almost all of my images nowadays, I used to take a lot of my own images, but because so much of this work is about perfect bodies, sometimes celebrity, not this body of work, but when I say perfect, I mean sort of this like, the notion of the Greek ideal that American culture just pumps out ad nauseum. I used to cut up images from books, make collages, and then work from them. And many of the decisions I make in my paintings are an absolute direct response to what I was told I shouldn't do when I was being educated. Working with photography, that watercolor couldn't be serious, working with a digital mechanism, working with mediation, stealing images as an appropriation artist. All of those things I was told, don't do. We don't do that. Real artists don't do that. It's stupid. So almost I'm still an insolent teenager in that I make every decision because I was told that would not be kosher when I was a kid. I hate to admit that, but that's true. So now I find images that very much speak to a sense of nostalgia in my upbringing. I'm an 80s brat. I was a walking television set. I consumed a lot of screens. I was like the last year of Gen X. And so I was very, 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 very neglected. And the TV was my babysitter. The entire summer, the TV was my babysitter. So screens I have like a love-hate relationship with, also an addiction to. So I make these kind of culling through the internet. I search a lot of things, a lot of different venues to find images that I know will be at least appealing for me to paint. So that's the first impulse is, ooh, I like the color. I like that texture. I like that leg. I like that muscle. I really want to paint it, just technically. Drawn to something as desire. I don't lust after images. Like I don't, you know, like I think a lot of people out there in the world do, and I think that's fine, but it's just not how I operate. Because I used to work with models and I used to pay models and like that's just, but obviously like beauty and sexuality are the dominant. So I find these images, I then create a digital collage that usually is pointing to either the objectified part, the buns, the mustache, the abs, right? Whatever. Or the like a very subtle micro expression. Over here in the back, we've got a guy kind of oddly reaching, makes no sense. That to me are actually really queer, right? Or the way a woman might sit, right? These coding things that queer bodies do, gay bodies do when they're comfortable, taking up space and not hiding it. And I then work with them to create new designs that are ultimately like, sometimes they're like mandalas. So there's an image back here. You know, these kind of act like mandalas, but that's a true mandala, right? Not in the prayer sense, but in the meditation sense of the repeating formal elements in order to create this sort of circular tableau, right? I'm really, really interested in creating spaces, but I'm also really interested in straddling the line of abstraction and representation. They're monstrous for a reason. So they're beautiful, like prototypic images that become. Y'all saw John Carpenter's The Thing in the 80s as well? No? The monster is this sort of like alien that it turns into a kind of Cthulhu, right? Cthulhu, is that it? Lots of tentacles. So they become sort of these hysterical expressions of both queer joy and monstrous and repulsive. They're impossible. And they're monstrous and repulsive because oftentimes queering images makes people really, really uncomfortable. Just pictures of queer people being queer makes people uncomfortable. And so I want to play with that. And I paint them in watercolor because I love watercolor. It breathes life into my world. It has an inherent, like, it's dismissed throughout art history as something that's sketchy and feminine. You do it on Sundays. But there's an inherent light to the way that watercolor works and a responsiveness to the paper. So in oil painting, you're loading on your whites. It's not the white of the canvas. You generally don't let the white of a canvas show. But in watercolor, it's a reversal of that painting structure if you're trying to create volumes. So you let the white of the paper act as the whites. And so there's a luminosity to it. I also don't matte them anymore. A lot of people bitch and moan about how they like ruffle, but they're on paper. They're vulnerable. I paint on paper and I paint in watercolor because if you mishandle it, it's gone. So they are in a weird way a meditation on our own mortality. I think all painting is that, right? They're vulnerable, they're tender, they're small for that reason. But they're also watercolors that generally are not like normal watercolors. There's no florals. It's not pastoral scenes, right? So that's sort of it in a nutshell. I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to bore you. So do you guys have questions? I'm happy to take them. I used to make what we call pastiche, which is an amalgam of many different images in one image. I thought that that was the way to claim an image as my own. And these, when I take one image, a single image, and I abstract it on itself, there's a kind of discomfort that I have The repeating element, like slicing, copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste, is a reference to the glitch. But it's also meant to kind of like display momentum and movement. So it's a still moment that is suggestive of movement, right? Flailing, running, movement, spinning, intertwined, limbs. Really, it's creating movement in painting, at least how I was trained, is a design element. We can do things like have a point in order to create discomfort. We can kiss edges of forms to also create discomfort. We can stack in order to create a notion of space, circle in front of the square. With these, it's all on the surface, right? So I don't do things like cut this part off and then create a drop shadow so it looks like paper, right? I want them to sort of look like corrupted images, corrupted digital files, right? Even though they're meticulously created. And I could probably pop these into AI and be like, create some repeating weirdness. There is a redundancy to my presence in these, right? Even just painting them is redundant. I used to use magazines. I used to buy all kinds of magazines from eBay. And I've said this before, and my wife has probably heard it a million times now, but I started to feel really guilty about cutting up books. Like ephemera had a weird value to me. And the digital just seems really disposable. And that makes sense because that's what my work is about. I'm also braver with it. So I don't know if I'd say reckless, but yeah, I'm much braver with it. And many of the source images that I actually use, I get from like Pinterest. They're really, really crappy resolution. And I'm a photorealist, so I need a certain kind of like tangibility in order for them to work. I'm not a loose painter by any means. So I don't know. There's sort of the fun of figuring it out technically, but also like, yeah, I can destroy this image until I can't use it anymore. But I can also just go undo, undo, undo. Do I want to make it? Is this going to drive me nuts? This is the first body of work the last 2 years where I'm like repeating things ad nauseum. If you've ever tried to paint a nose 16 times, you kind of want to die at the end of it. Because you're painting the same nose and you're trying to create a sort of facsimile of that process. Like I actually paint a hand and I don't touch that other hand. It would be smarter if I painted all the hands at the same time up to the same level, but like it can get insane. So there's a balance between what I want to paint, what's really going to speak to me, but also the design. I'm not a great designer. I'm actually not a very good designer. So if it has balance, if it has a color scheme that I really like, if it speaks to the body of work that I'm trying to make, right? If it has the good vibes that I'm trying to make, right? Yeah. And why I say good vibes is a lot of painting that's about queer life is negative. It's about struggle. And so I think right now we're charged, at least in this political climate, to consider making images about joy when we can get them. In a weird way, even though these images are very, very timely in their 70s and 80s look, I also think they're very dated in the now. I think 10 years from now, we're going to look back at these and be like, oh, that was queer coding. I mean, when two men are hugging on a dance floor, duh. But if I were a man painting that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I talk a lot to my students about it's not necessarily about identity politics. It's about being able to navigate what the intentions of the artist are by acknowledging the artist's identity. In terms of like, if I'm really honest, in the early 90s, those high cut swimsuits, I had one. And I was a diver, and oh God. And the things they used to make us wear during these meets was also like a queer awakening. I looked, and I love men. I always get people wondering why I paint men. I paint men for two reasons. Men are primarily my base. They're the ones that buy my work off the wall. Women just haven't. I have two collectors in Miami who are women that buy my work. The rest are men. But in all reality, I am trying to make work about archetypes of beauty. And men in the queer world experience the same bullshit that women do in the straight world about their bodies. They have in fact, they have even more eating disorders than women do of the same age range. Like, so in a weird way, even though it seems celebratory of these sort of beauty standards, they're also about exclusivity. The images around the corner of the black and whites, those are, they're black and white because they're antiquated, and it's masculinity and femininity, right? Make oneself big, make oneself small. It's that pendulum I'm sort of interested in. So like if I were to distill it, they're queer because I make them and I'm queer, but also these are things that I'm just attracted to looking at. A big hulking back with a tattoo on it of a man is equally beautiful to me as some woman in her backyard like flexing for her husband. She just got into bodybuilding. So like, it's these strange, they're not narrative, right? But it's those strange narratives that actually give me some sort of like weird repulse and attraction. That probably doesn't answer your question. That was not very direct. It's the best answer I can give. C+. So when I don't want to make like mock-ups, I call them mock-ups before I paint them. I just scour the internet and I make folders and folders and folders and folders. So I have like a kind of archive. I have a terrible memory in life, but I have a great visual memory. So I literally can kind of remember every single image that I save onto my computer or save on my Pinterest board, because I still use Pinterest as a way to like hold these things. You know what Pinterest is? Okay. I'll go, I think I want to paint skates this week, just skates. And I'll remember that I have like 3 images of skates, even if I saved them 8 months ago. So I'll just pull from those. I'll mess around with them. When I don't want to be in the studio and painting, I think of this as like sort of like planning. And I'll just break up my creative time by like making the mock-ups. So like Amber, I might sit next to Amber and be like, oh, look at these 10 new ones. And I'll listen to her and she'll go, oh, ooh. And so I feel a little bit of this from these grunts that she makes, but also like, ooh, I actually really like these 3. So, and the rest, just go in the archive and I'll never paint them. When I was in graduate school, a man named Dennis Sargent, who I respect very much, was a bit of a bitch. And he would come to my studio in Milwaukee and he would say, Melissa, it's not, your paintings aren't interesting. It's the fact that you insist on making them that's interesting.